Welcome to the Oakles channel. Thanks for watching today. Let's go ahead and rank all the bosses from easiest to hardest in Dark Souls 2. Now, yeah, I know a lot of people don't really like Dark Souls 2 or don't consider it a true Souls game. It doesn't really match up with the storyline of 1 and 3. But hey, I love Dark Souls 2. I do think it's a true Souls game, and I think it's amazing how many bosses are in this game. This is the most number of bosses that any Souls game had, all the way up until Elden Ring. And there's a lot of other benefits to Dark Souls 2, but that's a different conversation for a different video. We're here to rank all the bosses from easiest to hardest, so let's get started. In 41st place, and yes, there are 41 bosses in this game, which is phenomenal, but in 41st place is the Dragonrider. He is the easiest boss in the entire game. Not only can you cheese him super easily by just simply having him basically charge off the edge and die on his own, but even if you don't cheese him, you can just simply stay behind him the entire battle, take a few slices, and as he starts to turn around, just get behind him again and just stay behind him the entire fight, and he never actually turns around fast enough to actually hit you. And so he is the easiest fight in the entire game. In 40th place, we have the Covetous Demon, and this fella's like a giant slug. It makes you feel like you're playing a Star Wars game, because he looks just like Jabba the Hutt here, but he is super slow, and basically his only fast move is where he jumps up in the air and tries to slam down on you, but even that's pretty easy to avoid. But if he wasn't easy enough already, but based upon being one of the largest bosses and the slowest bosses, if you want to shoot at the little jars up in the sky, when they drop down, they bust open and there's a fella inside the jar, and the Covetous Demon just can't resist, goes over there, tries to attack the fella, and you have all these free shots on him, or free hits on the Covetous Demon, when he's not even attacking back. So not only is he super slow, super large hitbox, but also you can fight him with him not even fighting back. That puts him in the second to last place in this game. In 39th place, we have the Prowling Magus and the Congregation, and this really doesn't even feel like a boss battle. It feels more like just a room full of normal enemies, or normal sorcerers, and it's super easy to take out. You sort of go in there, slice away, do your magic spells. I'm doing poison in this particular video, but I mean, like, it's not even really a boss fight. It's just a room full of enemies, and so it's hard to put it any higher on the list because there's nothing special about this particular boss. And up next we have the Royal Rat Vanguard, and I only put him one place above the Prowling Magus and the Congregation because much like the last battle, this one just sort of feels like a room full of enemies once again. You have all these little mice or all these little rats running around, and none of them actually count toward the boss counter at all, but once you kill enough of them, the Royal Rat will drop down from the same spot every single time above the little sewer here, and when he drops out, you only have to attack that one rat to win the entire battle, and he doesn't even really have like an extra large health bar. Yeah, I know it looks huge at the bottom of the screen here, but it's the exact same health as a normal rat. And so when you attack him, you can take him out in just a matter of a few hits, and then you've won the entire battle. The hardest part is just sort of finding him amongst the midst of all the other rats, but he has these little spikes on his back, and he always drops from the same spot. And so he's just a really easy boss, and I mean, I can't help but put him in the very bottom part of this list. In 37th place, we have the Last Giant, and I really hate to put this boss so low on the list, but I mean, he is really easy. I just simply like the lore, and that's why I hate to put him so low, because I mean, he is the last giant. I mean, the area that he's found in is called the Forest of the Fallen Giants, because when they die, they turn into trees, and so he is the last of all of his kind, and I don't know, it's just something heartbreaking about that, and I just like his lore. But regardless, super easy boss. He is super slow. He just sort of lumbers over to you, takes these slow swings at you. You can roll between his legs, get a few slices in or a few spells in, run off to the other side of the arena. I mean, there's almost no way to die against this boss. Halfway through, he does pull his arm off, and he's a little bit faster at that point, but honestly, you can still just sort of do the same strategy, roll between his legs, and I can't imagine anyone having very much trouble with him, and that's probably why he's the first boss in the game, because he's not very hard. But still, not being hard puts him pretty low on the list. And up next is the Old Dragon Slayer, and if you play Dark Souls 1, he's going to look really darn familiar because he's just a rehash of Ornstein from that game. But the difficult part of Ornstein was it was a 2 versus 1 fight. In this game, it's a 1 versus 1 fight. And all of his moves are so easy to bait out. He has a long wind-up for all his choreographed moves, and it's just super easy to learn this fight. I really think it's a good fight in the game because there's so many bosses and so many enemies that are going to be armored dudes like this guy, and so when you go against him, he's really training the player how to fight against these type of enemies. So I think it's a good fight in the game, but since he is sort of like a training boss to me, I think he does belong toward the bottom part of this list. And in the 35th place, we have the Royal Rat Authority, and this really feels more like a dogfight because, I mean, Look at him, he's not a rat, this is definitely a dog. I mean, just by the bone structure and the height of the legs, this is definitely a dog and not a rat. And it sort of feels like a watered down version of Sith from Dark Souls 1, because he doesn't have a sword or anything like that, but he has the same like jump moves. And without the sword, he's just not really threatening. You can sort of roll under him when he does most of his attacks or when he jumps towards you, and you get a lot of free slices in, and he's really weak in that aspect as well. And I just can't imagine a lot of players having a lot of difficulty when fighting this boss. I'd say the hardest part is just simply making sure you take out all the little small rats at the start of the fight so they don't get distracted throughout the battle. But once you take those out, I mean, this guy's a piece of cake. And so to me, in 35th place, that matches up pretty well. And up next we have the Old Iron King, and this is a really fun boss fight, especially after it comes up to the hellish Iron Keep level, which is a really difficult level inside the game. But when you finally get to the Old Iron King, he's really simple, and all of his moves have these long, wind-up, choreographed, and I mean, if you can't predict which moves he's going to do, it's really more on you than the game at this point. But the moves are so easy to avoid. You can hide behind a building, you can just sort of stand off to the side of the fist, and once he does a move, he just sort of stays there for so long afterwards, and he can be punished so much on almost every single move that he does. And I think it's almost a relief for most players when they finally get to him, and I think the majority of players are going to beat him on the first try because his moves are just so easy to learn. Next we have the FLEXILE Sentry, and first off, I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia that I didn't know about this boss until like really recently. He's not got a helmet on his head, he actually has a lizard on the top of his head, so it's like a lizard in this giant armored costume. Had no idea about that. If you already knew that, that's awesome. I just simply didn't know. But this boss, it looks really, really threatening. He's really, really fast on some of his moves, and he's really powerful, but he's really, really easy to sort of bait out and sort of run past him, and then let him do his little fit over there, get a few slices in, get a few spells in, and just sort of bait the attack out again. If you just sort of run from corner to corner, he basically follows the same pattern every single time. A lot of bosses are sort of easy to bait into a certain routine, and the FLEXILE Sentry definitely falls into that category. Just run from one corner to the other, and pretty much all of his moves are easily avoidable, and this massive lizard war machine of sorts can be taken down in no trouble. And then we have the Skeleton Lords here, and I understand that a lot of fights that I've put pretty low so far have been the overall like group fights or just sort of overloading you with a ton of enemies, and this fight could sort of fall into that. However, I like the aspect that depending on which lord you kill at which time determines which army of the skeletons is going to arise from the ground. When you kill one of them, the little wheel skeletons come out of the ground. When you kill another one, a massive army of them come out of the ground. And of course, if you kill the final one, just sort of more powerful skeletons come after you. And so I like the aspect that you can sort of time which enemies you want to appear when inside the battle. So it actually adds a little bit more complexity to it compared to some of the other group fights thus far on the list. And that's why it's a little bit higher on the list. But I actually still enjoy this fight, and I always sort of look forward to it when it comes across in the game. And then we have MYTHA or MYTHA, the Baneful Queen. I'm not sure which way it's pronounced, but this is basically Medusa. I mean, look, it looks like a Greek goddess here. She's even holding the head off to the side. It just simply doesn't turn you to stone. And that would actually been a pretty cool aspect if it could add that into the game. But regardless, that's not part of the game, so we're not judging the boss on what it could have been. We're just simply judging it on what it is. But you basically fight the entire battle in this little poison area. And honestly, if you just simply summon Thomas the Jester before you even go into the battle, this is going to be a piece of cake fight because Thomas can pretty much win the battle for you. But even if you don't summon Thomas, this is a pretty standard 1 versus 1 fight inside the game. She's not an overwhelming boss. She's not a giant boss. And it just sort of tests the player on how well they are at dodging and things like that inside the battle. This is a pretty standard boss in the game. But like I said, if you summon Thomas, you really don't even have a battle here to fight. In 30th place we have the Scorpionness NAJKA, and I love that this fight actually like worked the cheese into it for like all players to figure out and all players to do. Because at one point she sort of slams her tail down like this and just sort of stays there, and even if you didn't like know how to do cheeses in the game, your natural thought process is just simply to climb up the tail and at least see what happens. And if you climb up the tail, you can just sort of stand on her back here and you can just slice away or do your spells or whatever, and she's completely frozen out. This is a completely cheesed boss, super easy to do, and I can't help but think that the game actually wanted you to do it because it's just so obvious looking when the tail flops down like that. It's like a Mario Kart ramp. You can't help but want to travel up it and at least see what happens when you get onto the back of this Scorpionness. So to me, this is a battle that was meant to be cheesed, and it's super easy to actually do the cheese. In 29th place, we have the Rotten, which is basically a slow conglomeration of a bunch of undead here who are all sort of melted or merged together. And this fella's pretty darn slow. If you thought the Covetous Demon was slow, this fella's even slower. His moves are very slow, especially his only real main attack is slamming down with the Butcher's Knife here. If you just sort of roll into him while he's doing the attack, it is super easy to dodge through that or roll through it. And you sort of run off to one side of the arena, wait for him to get over there, roll into him, take a few slices, run off to the other side of the arena. This boss is a really slow boss, and it's super easy to get some free hits in on him and then run away. The hardest part here is just simply the arena that he's in. It has all these little fire pits, and if you accidentally run through a fire pit, they'll do way more damage to you than you'll probably ever take from actually fighting the Rotten on his own. So to me, the Rotten belongs in the lower half of the list. In 28th place, we have the Executioner's Chariot, and this reminds me a lot of a boss fight out of Demon Souls. And what I mean by that is just simply a gimmicky boss, or there's a particular way that you're supposed to fight the battle, and when you do it their particular way, it's almost an instant kill. And so all you have to really do here is just sort of work your way along the hallways here, take out the little summoners. Once you take them out, the Executioner's Chariot will take out the rest of the skeletons on its own, and you just simply pull the little lever here, and it knocks a little gate down, and the Executioner's Chariot runs into the gate, and you simply have to take one hit, and it sort of falls in the hole here. You don't ever actually have to engage the Executioner's Chariot, and really the hardest part here is just simply working your way up the hallway, taking out the little summoners and things like that. And so it really does feel more like a gimmicky boss fight. I'm not going to say it's a bad boss fight, but it just sort of feels gimmicky, and once you know how to approach it and you know what to do, you really can't even lose on the fight. I will acknowledge it's a cool looking boss, I like the arena, I like the gimmick here of itself, but it's just difficult to rank it much higher because it is a gimmick fight. In 27th place, we have the Demon of Song, and once again, we're going back to, I guess, sort of Greek mythology here, because it's like the sirens. He's supposed to lure warriors in by singing its song, and then just sort of attack them and steal their souls. And so, I guess a lot of the game sort of pulls away from Greek mythology a little bit. I never really thought about that before. That is also another video for another day. But the Demon of Song is actually a pretty cool little boss here. It's basically a giant frog with a skull as its head. He can pull his little hood down, it's completely invincible, and that prevents players from just sort of running in here and slicing away to the side and getting an easy victory out of him. You have to actually sort of learn when he's going to be vulnerable, when he's going to lift that hood up, and you have to sort of time your attacks out. So the battle's going to take even the more experienced players a little while to actually, finish the battle up here. He's not necessarily a super difficult fight, but he is one you're going to have to actually learn the battle a little bit in order to actually finish him off. In 26th place, we have the Pursuer, and my lord, did I hate this boss the first time I went through the game. Because he just sort of pops up randomly throughout the game to just murder you when you don't even know he's around. And those occasions actually really hard to defeat him. But we're only going to talk about the time that's like sort of mandatory to defeat him, or if you want to consider a true boss fight here, he has a little boss HP bar at the bottom of the screen. And this boss fight here, he is still difficult, especially for new players who sort of walk in on the encounter here. But if you just sort of learn, you can run around the edge here, load the giant crossbow up, and take one massive fire to crossbow. It nearly kills him in one single hit. And so you can't really put him too far on the list because there's a built-in cheese of just simply using the crossbow here. And if you're lucky, you can get 2 shots in, and you kill him without even having to engage him at all. But even if you get to 1 shot in, almost all of his health is gone, and you can just sort of take a few slices, and you have him completely wiped out. So the Pursuer, he's sort of teetering on that midpoint of the list here, but if you encounter him any other time outside of this one particular spot, he's definitely be higher on the list, but he's not an official boss at those points either. And next up we have the Giant Lord, which appears in the Memories of the Giant, and if this boss was any earlier in the game, I think it would be a lot higher on the list, but since he appears so late in the game, he's a really easy boss to take out. He's not very fast, he has powerful attacks, but by this point you also have really powerful attacks in the game, and most players are going to be able to take him out with no trouble at all. There's no true cheese method to sort of work your way through it, but if you're a melee character, just sort of dodge around the feet. Most of it's pretty slow, most of it's pretty choreographed. If you're a mage character, just stand back and avoid the massive blast that comes at you. Toss out a few spells, and you have him taken out in no time. And the next boss fight is going to be the Lost Center, and this boss fight can vary in difficulty depending on how you manipulate the boss arena. If you go in there fighting it dark, you can't lock onto her at all. You can't say which attack she's doing, and it's actually a pretty tough fight. But if you just simply light the little oil passageways at the top and then sort of light the entire area up, You can lock onto her, you can see which move she's doing, makes the battle so much easier. And also there are 2 NPC summons that you can take into the fight with you, and they can pretty much distract her the entire fight while you just simply run up there, get a few slices in, and these NPCs like never die. I mean, one of them has like 2 giant shields to block like every attack, and this fight is super easy if you have it lit up, have the NPCs, and it's a complete piece of cake. If you go about it in the dark by yourself, yes, very difficult. But if you go in there with everything that the game offers you, which is what we're focusing on this list here, we're focusing on everything that the game offers you for these bosses when you're fighting them, the boss battle is very, very simple. In 23rd place at the Guardian Dragon, I have to say, Dark Souls 2 did a fantastic job handling the dragons for the series. Demon Souls, very limited dragons. Dark Souls 1 did a better job, but still not great with the dragons. Dark Souls 2, fantastic job with the dragons here. Now the first one you're going to come across, at least for our list here, is going to be the Guardian Dragon, and he's really not going to be that powerful compared to some of his counterparts later on in the game, because there's not many attacks that he has that are going to one-shot you unless you go in with like a really low level. But at this point in the game, you've already got some levels behind you, you're probably not going to be one-shotted by him, and when he finally does come down to the ground, he's very easy to get several attacks in, and his HP is just simply not overloaded like some of the later ones like the Ancient Dragon, and so you're going to be able to defeat him pretty quickly, and he comes down to the ground enough where you're going to be able to get a lot of punishing attacks in on him. But overall, I love how the dragons are handled in the game, and even though this one's a little bit easier, I still really love the Guardian Dragon fight. And speaking of dragons, next on the list is going to be the twin Dragon Riders, and you wouldn't think it'd be so much higher on the list than just simply Dragon Rider, but having 2 versus 1 is significantly harder than 1 versus 1, especially when one of them is sitting on the pedestal shooting arrows at you. And so you can't really do your normal 1 versus 1 melee where you simply get behind the Dragon Rider, you have to take out the archer first. But luckily, his HP is nowhere near as hefty as the original Dragon Rider, so take him out first, head back over to the melee one, and overall they won't be too bad, but they're definitely not going to be as low on the list since it's 2 versus 1 instead of 1 versus 1. And let's just keep the dragon train rolling here, and let's do the Ancient Dragon next, because the Ancient Dragon, despite having a massive, and I mean massive HP bar, and he can one-shot you in so many attacks, he has a method of cheesing him by getting between these 2 toes that I don't think I've ever even fought the battle the way it's intended. I always just simply go for the toe strategy. And if the toe strategy was all that there was to this boss, he'd be way lower on the list. But I have to acknowledge, if you don't do the toe strategy, he is much more difficult and would be a very hard boss inside the game. So therefore, I'm going to put him right smack dab in the middle of the list, because depending on how you fight him, if you exploit the cheese, super easy. If you don't, he's super hard, so I think he belongs right in the middle of the list in 21st place. And speaking of massive HPs, next up is King VENDRICK. And if you just simply go in there the first time you encounter him and try to fight him, you're going to have this enormous HP bar that I think would take you hours and hours to work through, because you don't have any of the giant Lord souls yet. But every soul that you get, his defense gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So if you go into the battle with all the souls, he's not that bad. He's pretty slow for the most part. Most of his moves are pretty choreographed. He does get sort of a speed boost every now and then, and it always catches me off guard when he does that one particular move. But outside of that, he's really not too bad of a boss. And the game really does intend for you to collect all of these souls before you go in there, because I mean, it's just a mechanic that's almost impossible to defeat him if you don't collect them. But I also like the lore behind VENDRICK, and I like when you actually get to go into his memory, but that's separate from difficulty. That's just me liking the overall lore of a character. But overall, VENDRICK belongs smack dab almost in the middle of the list as well. In 19th place is the final boss in the game, ALDIA the Scholar, the First Sin, and this boss is surprisingly easy for being the last boss in the game. It almost reminds me a little bit of Demon Souls once again, because that boss was just a joke, a piece of cake, and ALDIA is definitely harder than the true king in Demon Souls, but still, for a final boss in the game, it's a little bit on the easy side. Now if you didn't go through the entire DLC before you got to him, it might be a little bit harder, but most players are going to go for the DLC before they get to him, and so therefore I think he's going to be more of a mid-tier. Now there's also like 3 summons that you can take into the battle with you, which makes an easy fight even easier, but all of the moves are so slow, they're so telegraphed that you can predict almost everything that he's going to do here. Whether it's going to be throwing spikes out of the ground or fireballs at you, everything is just so obvious before it even comes close to hitting you that you can avoid almost every single attack. And of course he does have the gimmick of having the fire around him and you can attack while the fire is all around him. If you just simply wait till the fire is gone, he's very easy to be punished. I don't think he belongs in the lower half of the list, but he definitely doesn't belong anywhere near the top of the list, and so I'm going to put him sort of in the middle here as well. In 18th place we have the Throne Watcher and Defender, and it is definitely one of the harder 2 versus 1 fights in the game, and that's why it's in the top half of the list here. However, compared to some of the other 2 versus 1 or 3 versus 1 fights that we're going to encounter, it doesn't belong anywhere near those particular battles. So we're going to put it sort of mid-tier here. But also, there are 3 summons outside the gate that you can take in with you, and they can be distracted on the summons while you simply come up from behind and attack. And even if you don't want to use the summons, most players aren't going to get to the Throne Watcher and Defender until they've gone through all 3 of the DLCs, much like ALDIA. So when you finally approach them, you're going to be at a very good level to take them out pretty quick. And so therefore the Throne Watcher and Defender, much like a lot of the later game bosses outside the DLC, are going to be more on the easier side and more on the mid tier. Next up is the Ruined Sentinels, and some people might disagree with me putting them so high on the list here. However, the first time I played through the game, and the first time I got to them, it was like hell for me to finally get through this fight. These 3 armored robots, or warriors, or knights, or whatever they are, they gang up on you, and it is so easy to get overwhelmed by them, and they are so fast in the game as well. And so I actually had a lot of trouble going through it, and I think most players will, considering you fight them pretty early on in the game. And it is the first boss fight you're going to have where it's multiple bosses against the one of you. And 3 versus 1 is quite a bit this early in the game. And so I think the Ruined Sentinels is going to be sort of a brick wall for a lot of players. And so that's why I'm going to put them so high on the list here. But if you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Next up we have Nasandra, and if you don't have the Scholar of the First Sin Edition, Nasandra is the last boss in the game, and to me, she is more difficult than ALDIA, and therefore I'm going to put her a little bit higher on the list as well. Now she is the wife of King VENDRICK, and there's a whole lore behind her taking power from the throne, and it's a really interesting storyline. I honestly think if more people read into the storyline of Dark Souls 2 or the lore behind it, they'd enjoy the game a lot more. But for being the second to last boss in the game, she's not too bad except for when she puts the curse on you, and the curse can just simply zap your health away in no time, and then she can one-shot you with some less than powerful attacks after that. And so the curse part definitely makes the battle a little bit harder, but just like the other 2 final bosses in the game, they give you 3 summons before you go in there, and you've also gone through the DLC. And so like I said, the final bosses in the game, if you're going through the Scholar of the First Sin Edition, more than likely you're over leveled at this point, and they give you the summons, and I just can't justify putting any of these final bosses any higher on the list because of all the benefits that the game gives you. And next up we have Duke's Dear Freyja, and this is the coolest looking boss in the game. This is the best looking spider of any of the Souls games. This is such a awesome giant spider fight, and you can actually fight this spider twice. If you go into New Game Plus, there's a secondary location, you can fight the spider again, and it's a really cool boss fight. If you haven't done that one, I highly recommend it in the New Game Plus. But we're only going to talk about the original Duke's Dear Freyja right here. And I may be saying it wrong. A lot of these names I may be saying wrong. Feel free to let me know about that in the comments down below as well. But the Duke's Dear Freyja here, this giant spider, you basically has 2 heads on it, and you basically have to attack and destroy both of the heads here. And it doesn't make it any easier that there's all these spiders in the arena around you trying to attack you at the same time. And yes, you can ward those off by having a torch, but then you don't have a shield anymore. And so that makes the battle that much harder. Now you could go in there and try to kill all the spiders, but while you're doing that, of course, Duke's Dear Freyja could simply come through with his giant laser here and take you out as well. And so there's a lot of things going on in this boss fight all at once that can make it significantly harder. Now there are some summons that you can take into the battle, and that does make it easier, so the game is not making it impossible to go through this fight. But if you go in there without the summons, it will be one of the harder fights in the game. But because they do offer you the summons, I can't put it in the top 10, and therefore we're going to leave it at number 15. At number 14, we're going to put the Looking Glass Knight. Now this boss here is what most people consider like the true first hard boss in the game as you're going through it, and I can agree with that to some degree, but he's not going to be in the top 10, at least for me still, because a lot of his attacks are a little bit on the slower side, Most of them you can sort of tell that they're coming. I would say that most players put him higher on the list just simply because he can summon a helper. And if the helper comes from online, yes, the boss fight could be significantly harder because you're fighting probably at this point somebody who's an expert at the Souls games because they're still playing Dark Souls 2 and they got summoned into this fight to pretty much destroy you. But if you don't get him to summon an online player, or he's just simply playing offline, he's just going to summon in a pretty ordinary NPC, and it's just simply not that good at fighting against you. It's more of a distraction than it's going to be a killer. So if you can avoid that and just keep your focus on the Looking Glass Knight and use the exact same strategy you've been doing the entire battle, and just sort of watch out for those choreographed moves, he's not too bad of a fight. Alright, so I know we're not in the top 10 yet, but to me, all 13 of these bosses are very difficult, and we're still able to narrow them down of who belongs where, but just know that all of these bosses I consider pretty difficult bosses inside the game. But number 13, we're going to put the Belfry Gargoyles. Now this is obviously playing off Dark Souls 1, but in that battle, you only had 2 gargoyles coming at you at one time. And this game, sort of like they like to do in a lot of instances, is they just sort of overwhelm you with enemies. And they put a ton of gargoyles coming in on you all at once. I think at one point you're fighting like 4 or 5 gargoyles. I mean, it is ridiculous how much you're fighting at once. Yes, you can bring a summon into the battle with you. There's an NPC like at the bottom of the staircase. But even if you bring that summon in, it is still a very difficult fight. Because there's so many of them, they're not all going to focus on NPC. And they'll kill him very quickly because they're very powerful. And they have a very high HP. And to me, the Belfry Gargoyles is one of those fights that's just so overwhelming that it's hard to catch your breath sometimes. And so to me, even though it's not top 10, number 13 is the Belfry Gargoyles. And at number 12, we're going to continue on with another group fight. I'm just going to call them the Graverobbers, even though they have 3 separate names. We're just going to go with the Graverobbers. And the Graverobbers here, my gosh, it is so difficult to get them in one spot to really take on one at a time because you have this archer in the back who just continues to shoot at you anytime you try to get them isolated. And in order to win the battle, you almost have to get them isolated because if you fight 2 at once or 3 at once, they're just going to gain up on you and they're just going to destroy you and just smash you into the ground. So it almost feels like you're just simply running around in an 8 shape here as you're trying to get them just a little bit separated to get a few slices in. But even then, they have the ability to heal themselves. So that makes the fight even more annoying. This is a long fight, it's a difficult fight, but most of all, it is an annoying fight inside the game. In 11th place, we have the King's Pet, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here. AAVA, I don't know, but it is a very annoying fight. However, it is nothing compared to the next time that we're going to encounter the King's Pets. So just take this one as like a prequel to the next massive, disgusting fight. But this one here has got this giant cat that's coming at you, and you can avoid most of the attacks if you roll into the cat. But even then, the cat has some pretty darn powerful attacks, especially if it gets you in its mouth and sort of like slings you around and throws you at the ground. I mean, it can take away a significant amount of health all at once. This is definitely the easiest boss of this particular DLC. However, it is still a difficult fight for players first journeying into the Ice Castle. In 10th place, we have VELSTADT, the Royal Aegis. And to me, the hardest part of this battle is just simply the amount of damage that he can deal out with every single hit. Now, I know you can try to dodge it, you can try to avoid it, but if he does catch you, it just takes away so much health all at once. And you're going to be coming across him about halfway through the game, and so therefore you're not an over-leveled character, you're not super powerful, and therefore he's going to be a little bit more of a challenge for most players. Yes, you can go in there with some summons, and that's going to make it a little bit easier, but still, even if you have the summons, it's just going to increase his defense all that more, and he's going to still take them out with his powerful attacks. He's a difficult fight, no matter how you look at it, and so therefore, I'm putting him at number 10. Now we're going to group 9 and 8 together because they are both the Smelter Demon, but there is a difference on which one is where. And number 9 is going to be the Red Smelter Demon, and number 8 is going to be the Blue Smelter Demon. Now they fight almost exactly the same. They have almost the exact same attacks. It just simply boils down to that the Blue Smelter Demon is a little bit more powerful than the red one, and also there's a massive, disgusting boss run to get to the Blue Smelter Demon. I know it's not part of the actual boss, however, I'm going to include it in there because it is disgusting and it has to be mentioned how horrible that boss run is. But regardless, the Smelter Demons are very powerful. They are very difficult to take out. It takes a while to learn the moves of when to roll into them, when to roll to the right, which attacks you can finally punish on. They gain more power throughout the entire battle. I think there's 3 stages on each one of them. These are both very difficult boss fights in the game. I would say the red smelter demon can be harder to some players, just simply because you encounter him earlier in the game instead of later. But the blue smelter demon has a little bit more HP, a little bit more defense, and also that disgusting boss run. So I'm going to put the red one at number 9 and the blue one at number 8. In 7th place, we have the Dark Lurker. Now, there is so much work to do to even get to this boss fight. Now, it's not like a boss run, it's just so much of a quest line to even get to the Dark Lurker. But once you get there, he's very, very weak to fire. So if you're going a pyromancy build, this is like one of the easiest bosses in the game, especially for like in-game. If you're doing anything except for pyromancy, the Dark Lurker is a very difficult character. I remember the very first time I played Dark Souls 2 and I finally got to the Dark Lurker, I was doing a melee-based character and I got destroyed. I actually had to respec part of my character just to go against him with a more of a pyromancy or fire attacks, and I finally was able to beat him. Of course, now when I go through the game, I actually take in some fire spells to wipe him out pretty quick, and that's why he's not higher on the list, because he is so weak against fire attacks. But if you don't have fire attacks to Dark Lurker, oh my gosh, this is going to be the end of the game for a lot of players. And in 6th place, we have the best dragon in the game, SENTRY the Slumbering Dragon. Now, I say the best dragon in the game because the fight is actually a lot of fun, especially when you like memorize all the moves. It really just feels like a dramatic movie-like sequence when you're fighting against him. And so I actually really like this boss fight, but until you learn the moves, it is a very difficult fight to go through, especially considering that the dragon can poison you throughout the fight. And that just makes it all the more difficult, because then you have to take time to actually try to cure the poison, or just simply continue, downing Estus Flask, trying to keep the health alive. So there's a lot of things to do during the fight to just simply make sure it's going smoothly, but until you learn the moves, that makes it very, very difficult. I know the first time I went through the game, it took me a lot of tries to finally beat this dragon, but once you learn the moves, it's a very, very rewarding fight, it's a very fair fight, and it's one of my favorite fights in the entire game. Alright, so we're down to the top 5, and at number 5 we're going to have ALONNE. Now ALONNE is going to be very similar to Nasandra, however ALONNE can actually summon some amazing characters to fight against you. She can summon our number 10 boss on the list, VELSTADT, to come against you, and even if you kill him, she can summon him again, or summon some pigs, or summon some skeletons, and while all these summons are coming at you, she has these crazy powerful attacks to come and hit you with, this giant scythe to come and attack you with, as well as some dark fireballs or dark mage balls coming at you as well. There's so much going on in this fight that is difficult to keep up with everything, and almost everything is just so powerful against you. Yes, I know your character is powerful at this point as well, coming in toward the end part of the DLCs, but no matter how strong your character is or how much HP your character has, there's so much to keep up with during this fight, and there's so much damage that's being dealt out to you in very high amounts that it makes it difficult for almost any player going through the game. Now in 4th place, I'm going to put the FUME Knight, and I know some people say this is the hardest boss in the game, but to me, he's just simply not the hardest. And that doesn't mean I'm some great player or anything like that. I'm a pretty average Souls player for the most part, but this boss actually feels fair inside the game. As in, like, you learn his moves, you learn his mechanics, and you can actually win this fight. There's no like part where it just feels unfair, or he's like one-shotting you, or just sort of came out of nowhere. If you learn the fight, you can do the FUME Knight fight. It just simply takes some dedication on you as a player. And once again, I'm not saying it's an easy fight, I'm just saying it's a possible fight, and it feels like a fair fight. All of these top 5 battles are very difficult, there's no doubt about it, but this one of the top 5 feels like the most fair that you're going to go against. In 3rd place, I put the Burnt Ivory King. Now this fight here, it just takes so long before you can even like fight the boss. You have to drop down this little arena here. You've had to go through the level and rescue all these little knights to help you out. And of course, once you rescue them, they'll help you in the fight, but then you have all these little knights that you have to go through, battle the fight off first, have to seal these gates away, and finally, after all of that, and it's like 5 minutes of fighting at least every time, the Burnt Ivory King comes out, and he is incredibly powerful. His attacks, they don't one-shot you, but my gosh, they just zap the HP away. And you have to be very good at dodging these attacks, otherwise he's just going to destroy you. There are some attacks you can bait out, like when he sort of jumps at you. If you sort of roll through that, you can get a nice little slice in. But it's difficult to know when he's going to do that attack. It's difficult to bait that attack out. And it's the only attack that's truly punishable for most players. Yes, you can take summons into this battle with you. However, by the time you go through all these other parts of the fight, most of your summons are dead by that point. And so it usually does end up being a 1 versus 1 fight of you versus Burnt Ivory King. And like I said, he is a very tough boss to fight through. And so therefore, he's going in 3rd place. In 2nd place is going to be the Samurai Knight, SERAH ALONNE, and once again, if I'm saying it correctly. Now this fight here, it is extraordinarily difficult. It does have a pretty hard boss run to even get to him, but when you get there, he's a very tough fight to go through, as in some of his moves are hard to predict. They're not impossible. You can learn the boss fight here, but they are hard to predict, and they're very powerful when they do hit you, especially the one that like stabs into you, has like the little shadow attack and throws you down. It's not a one shot, but it might as well be, because by the time you get away from him, try to heal up, he's going to come at you again and take you out. There are a few areas in this fight where you can sort of get a little bit of space between you, like if you sort of work with the walls over here. But if you don't use those walls and you're simply trying to memorize the attack, there's almost no time for you to ever heal up because he is constantly coming at you. He's one of the only bosses that can actually parry you in the game, which is a pretty big deal. Yes, some of the later Souls games work with that, but he's the only one in Dark Souls 2 that can actually parry you, which makes the fight even more difficult against you. I put him as number 2 because he still feels like a fair fight overall, as in like you learn how the boss mechanics work, you try to learn which moves he's going to do, you can try to bait some moves out, and there are some ways you can work around the little corner here. And so I did put him as number 2 because he does feel like a fair fight, but he is still an extraordinarily difficult fight in this game. And in 1st place, I'm putting Lud and ZALLEN in the Frigid Outskirts. This is the absolute worst part of this game. I hate everything about the fight. I hate the boss run up to it, which I know is not supposed to be included in the boss fight, and I'm not including it, but I just wanted to mention it again. It is the worst aspect of this entire game. This area is horrible. You can't see anything in the area. You have these giant electric reindeers that come out and attack you. You try to avoid them. You get lost. You get turned around. You may end up walking back to the beginning of the level. You find these little safety areas of these buildings, but there's all these bosses in there, and before you know it, the reindeers can burst through there as well. This is the absolute worst area in the entire game. But once again, that's not the boss fight. When you finally get to the end of it, you go up against 2 of the King's Pets, Lud and ZALLEN. And yes, you should be able to predict their moves pretty easily, just like you could against the first King's Pet you go against. However, when it is 2 versus 1, they are both fast, they're both powerful, and it is very difficult to get the upper hand in this fight. Yes, you can try to summon people, but all your summons are way back at the very beginning of the Frigid Outskirts, and most of them don't even make it to the Fall Gate with you, so you end up summoning them, which strengthens the boss, and then you don't even get to use them inside the boss fight. It is the most infuriating thing imaginable when you do a summon, and then it dies either immediately at the boss fight, or before it gets to the boss fight. But like I said, you go into this boss fight, it feels completely unfair as you're going against them because you can't really bait out the moves, you can't really choreograph the moves, you can't try to figure out what to do when, because you're just simply getting gamed up on constantly, especially when they have distance attacks and melee attacks. I can't say enough how much I hate this part of the game. To me, this is one of the worst parts of any of the Souls games, and it's one of the most unfair parts of any of the Souls games as well. So therefore, Lud and ZALLEN, the number 1 most difficult boss in Dark Souls 2. But what do you all think? Do you agree with my list? Who do you rank as the hardest boss in all of Dark Souls 2? Who do you rank as the easiest boss? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check my other videos listed up above. And go out there, find a great game to play, and just simply have a great rest of the day.